what I'm going to talk about is going to kind of lead into, just for like the last 20 minutes or so, bring all the speakers back and kind of talk about a few things. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of vampire studies, because that's what this is all about. The field has changed quite a bit over the past 500 years into what we study, and it's kind of really interesting with the previous question. If we look at the beginning of vampire studies as it is, we've got Catholic priest, Catholic bishop, Catholic priest, so-called Anglican priest. So for a really long time, the study of vampires was through the church, and that is what they were doing. But of course, they weren't looking at modern so-called vampires. They were looking at the vampire folklore, and that's kind of where all of our research comes from, up until we started getting into things like in the United States, in the turn of the century. But these, especially the first three here, all have writings, and we're talking from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, treatises on various types of apparitions that could be vampires. Calmet's book, Phantom World, covers a lot of things, but we have some very specific examples of vampire folklore from Bulgaria, Serbia, places like that. And then, of course, we get into the 18th century when we have actual handwritten accounts from doctors, people sent from the cities, from the emperor. The empire when Austria took over Serbia, and the imperial forces actually sent people out to investigate these burials. So unlike New England, where sometimes they would happen to get in the news, the empire is like, well, we got to go check this thing out, and the government actually sent people out to look, and they wrote full accounts of what they saw. And it's very similar what the people were doing. It was really interesting. One of the questions I might have you answer later is, when we're in Eastern Europe, it's a vampire's belief is religious. When we're in New England, a lot of times those people were not. It wasn't based on religion. A lot of times it was just based on just superstition outside of the church, because they weren't Eastern Christians or Roman Catholics in New England. It was outside of that belief. So how did those beliefs transfer is kind of interesting. But our first couple of hundred years of vampire studies is all folklore, and it is based a lot in the church. Then we do get more people, and a lot of these have already been talked about today. Floresco and McNally. We started to get into Dracula studies, obviously in the 20th century. That becomes a whole another field with Elizabeth Miller. The two in here in the middle, Paul Harbour, whose book we've seen come up a couple of times, is one of the best books that you can find, The Vampire's Burial and Death. If you want to read those first-hand accounts, the whole first couple of chapters are just the actual accounts from those early Serbian stories. And then he goes into a lot of the apotropaics, or ways that you can prevent vampirism, or ways that people might become one. And then Perkowski, who was a Slavic vampires studies scholar, who now wants nothing to do with the field at all, and won't even answer, won't even answer inquiries about it, and doesn't want to be associated with his books anymore. And Barbara, who we cannot find. Right, several of us in this room have tried to contact him many times, and nobody knows where he is anymore. So it's really interesting, but those are two really great works. And then again, Elizabeth Miller, whose writings on Dracula have been very important. She has really gone, in many ways, totally against McNally and Floresco's idea of Vlad the Impaler and Dracula being tied. Elizabeth would tell you that that's totally not the case at all. She's written several books about it. And she makes a really good case, because she is the editor of the Bram Stoker's notes. So you can, she's seen them firsthand, which actually Floresco and McNally saw them firsthand as well. But they still didn't make the assumption that that Stoker really didn't know that much about Dracula. And nowadays, Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew, Dacre Stoker, is traveling the world trying to tell people these same things and new information about Stoker's writing. So we have these two kinds of fields at first: the folklore studies, and then in the 20th century we get into Dracula studies. And then we've got this new word. right? And I'm surprised it actually has not come up yet until Joseph's talk, right? We haven't talked about it. And we went, I think we had about 30 different names with the word vampirology in it for this conference. We decided not to use it, but the whole time we were talking about we need to get this word to have, you know, a better meaning and to be more respectful or respected. So vampirology, you know, literally is just the study of vampires or vampire mythology. The problem that we see now, and that we see in a lot of online groups, is everybody thinks a vampirologist is something different, or that it needs to be something different, when really it should just be all of us. You know, anybody who studies anything that has to do with vampires. So I kind of come up with some of the fields in vampirology that maybe we can start to look at. Folklore, mythology, history, those might all be, you know, kind of tied together. You've got Dracula studies as a literary field or as a historical field. I tend to do a lot more research on Vlad the Impaler and things like that, and kind of separating him. But the talk I gave last year when I was traveling around campuses was actually called Separating Vlad the Impaler from, you know, the Count, and trying to show that they are different. Then you've got literary vampires, vampires in film, pop culture, psychology, sociology, medicine, all these different things that we've been talking about are some of the different fields. So what I wanted to do today with our speakers is kind of, you know, have them maybe as a first question say what did they think some of the fields need to be, you know, that we need to move on forward. We've got a lot of folklore, you know, research that's been done, especially with the Slavic, you know, in the European. There's a lot of Dracula studies, right? There's lots of Dracula studies, as we saw with the numbers in Gordon's book, with the over 1,400 Dracula articles. You know, there's probably enough Buffy work so far with 1,200 or so sources on that. So what are some of the topics that we should be looking at? How should we go about it? What are we missing? What's not there yet? And kind of where do you think the field of vampirology is going, or where should it be going? Or do you agree that vampirology and vampire studies are two different things? Possibly so. So if I don't know if you guys want to come down here, we can pass the microphone around. So I'd like to invite Dr. Melton, Dr. Garza, Laycock, Dr. Bell, and also Anthony Hogg, who again is here visiting us from Australia, who is one of the people who kind of helped coin the word vampirologist in the past 5 or 10 years through several blogs. First the Diary of an Amateur Vampirologist, and then just the Vampirologist in several online groups. So I'll just bring them all down and see if anybody wants to answer that, and then we'll take other questions and kind of move on from here. You might want to go first. You want to talk about vampirology? You can sit on this row.
Sit on this side of the...
Either side is fine.
All right.
And we want to stay on first.
The standing's good.
Why don't you tell us your ideas on vampirology? Since
my background's on vampirology. I refer to myself as a vampirologist. I'm actually one of the few people in the world to actually do that. There's a tiny handful. Don't be surprised to see Joseph refer to himself as one. That to me gives an idea of the diversity of study as Dax covered there. My personal take on it is from a historical slash skeptical slash detective kind of perspective. What I like to look at is historical sources. I've had this conversation with Michael. I tend to have a genealogical view of it. Like, show me the specific use of the word, or because I tend to play it safe in terms of how I use it. But what fascinates me about these conversations is that I actually like the class of information, because that is what helps refine knowledge. Knowledge is born through a baptism of fire. You know, you can't refine any kind of field without having it contradicted in some way. Otherwise, you're just validating your own position. That's not how you develop knowledge at all. So my take on it is very conflicted, but I fight hard against that in my online dealings mainly. But I see it as a necessary process, because when I engage in that sense, I learn more about myself. And I'll tell you this, that the thing that gives away most, I think the interest that someone has in vampires is reflected on when they were first exposed to it, and it carries through into their field of study. My background on it was when I was a kid, I was interested in the supernatural. When I was 12, I wanted to be a parapsychologist. Then I started. Then the night before I went to grade 6, I think you could call it elementary school here, we call it primary school in Australia. I watched Fright Night Part 2 on TV, and it was all over from there because it incorporated so many different elements of what had already interested me. It had the good versus evil narrative, which, as you've seen, is something that's shifting because our culture has changed along with it. The vampire is an adaptable being that follows where we go. You know, that's what catches on in certain culture. Gordon talked before about the vampire was just a bad guy, that was it. I think the development of the thing is more subtle than that, and it incorporates many weaves until it becomes solidified into one thing. That's continuously in a state of flux. That's why I debate about it, because I think there's something that we can learn from each other by bouncing ideas off each other. So my concept of vampirology is whatever you want it to be. It's whatever chosen perspective you have on it, whatever you can bring to the field. Whether it's Barbara brought in forensic pathology, Michael's got the forensic part of it, the folkloric background, Joseph has got his religious studies background, so has Gordon. Garza's got the Slavic studies, and Dax has a similar interest in folklore to me. Everyone pulling together is what creates a field. That's what vampirology is to me.
I'll be brief. I'll be brief. Do I need the mic? I don't need the mic. It just intimidates.
It helps the camera.
I'll do it if it does the camera. I'll do it for the camera. Probably my distinction between vampirology and vampire studies, and I really don't have any kind of passionate proclivities one way or the other than a purely semantic one, and probably one in my personal history, which was when I first became, when I first was degreed, as it were, to be a specialist in something, I was called a Sovietologist, because it was still the Soviet Union. It was 1987, and so I was a Sovietologist, and our field was Sovietology, and it had this that very clinical sound to it, like sociology, biology, cosmology, Sovietology, vampirology. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, we all thought, well, what are we now? Russologists? We didn't call us that. We didn't call it Russology, so we became Russian studies specialists. And indeed, that was the right phrase, the right collocation, because we are now, those of us who do the post-Soviet thing, so eclectic, and it is such a field that is built on an amalgamation, if you will, of different fields. It really is interdisciplinary. It's what I love the most about vampire studies, is that as we look just at the group assembled, and at all of you, whatever your interests are, wherever they lie, that's part of the study, and it's so cool. There's not like a catechism here. There's not, this is what you need to study if you do vampirology or vampire studies. Each one of you will bring to it what your interests are. It's interdisciplinary. It's extremely cool that way, because I think what we've missed, we're talking also now, my last bit here is, what's the next question? Are the questions being asked now as we've gone into gender studies, as we're going into queer studies, and that doesn't, as I try to explain to my students, every time they hear queering the vampire, they think, oh, you're making the vampire gay. Well, possibly, but queering something simply means making it different, making it something that it wasn't before. Queering the vampire is looking at it in a way it hasn't been looked at before. Maybe it is through looking at it through sexuality, maybe it's looking at it through gender studies. But for me, queering the vampire is making it something it hasn't been before. It's when Polidori first makes the vampire indigenous. He's one of us. He's not the outsider. He's one of us. He queers it, and there it is. So the next step for me, anyway, is finding a new way to queer the vampire. Yeah. What's the gentleman? Fight over the mic. I'm going to throw it in the middle of the room. And
reminded of the film The Usual Suspects. I feel like
We're all
Anthony's discussion made me think of a problem in religious studies, which is that we don't actually know what religion is. So in Texas, football is a religion. I mean, seriously, it functions as a religion, ritual, collective meaning, all this sort of thing. But it's not a religion in the same way that Christianity is a religion, right? So we had a moment where I think in the early 20th century, someone came up with 200 different definitions of what religion is. And some people said, well, that's it. We can't have a Department of Religious Studies, right? Just pack it up, right? Because we don't know what we're studying. Right? And then J.G. Smith came in, a famous scholar from the University of Chicago, said, no. This just means we have 200 useful ways of defining what religion is. And so the problem is we need to be very specific about how we're using it in our research. And I think this is also true of the word vampire, right? We have numerous kind of definitions of what people can mean by vampire, and I think the next kind of step is to get more sophisticated about it. So if we're taking this particular version of a vampire as kind of a way of understanding tuberculosis and kind of folk medicine, or a subculture, or we're looking at literary perspectives, right? I think that that will kind of help us have a more robust discussion about this topic. Hot potato.
Yeah, for me, I tend to prefer vampire studies to vampirology. Primarily, it's a matter of scholarly distance, I guess you could say. I have been associated with several fields of study where they were part of public controversies, and you get sucked in to if you're studying parapsychology or if you're studying new religions, then you must believe that there's something out there you're actually studying. I remember when I lived in Evanston, Illinois, I was right down the street from J. Allen Hynek and was invited to be on the board of the Center for UFO Studies. And they were very disturbed at me because I said, your problem with UFO studies is you don't have any UFOs to study. You don't have any little green men, you don't have any pieces of spaceships, etc. All you have is phenomena that may or may not have been caused by those kinds of things. But we do want some distance in our study, and I think the term parapsychologist has been used for the Van Helsings of the world. And I know that as soon as I got into the study, I ran into Sean Manchester, and all of a sudden, here's this guy styling himself a vampirologist who's going out claiming he's staking vampires in Highgate Cemetery in London. So it's that's to me part of the problem. I'm a little over that now, but I still kind of prefer the vampire studies thing.
I've never heard of the Highgate thing. What is that? I stay away from two things, the vampire community and the Highgate stuff.
Well, several comments about vampire studies or vampirology. Folklore has always had an issue with that term being the label of our field of study, as well as a commonplace notion for something that's not true. It's just folklore. So I'm used to that. And I'm also used to the idea of being interdisciplinary, because folklore as an academic pursuit is totally interdisciplinary. And I think that's the beauty of what we have here, is that you get many different perspectives on several important issues. And what I can bring as a folklorist to say people who are studying the literary or popular culture vampire, I think, is valuable. What people in Slavic studies can bring to my perception of the vampire is certainly in the same way. And so I think that is a blessing for all of us. My interest didn't start out as vampires or in vampires. It's hard for me to say that I'm a vampirologist. I really am interested in folk belief systems and the legends that support them. And that goes for the vampire incidents in New England, as well as, say, the African-American voodoo belief systems that I studied much earlier in my career, which I still am involved in. So,
are there any other questions for anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. So, in y'all's opinion, what is it about vampires that kind of sustain them? And what I mean by that is, as kind of an interesting thing in our society, you know, to compare to, you know, other monsters, mummies or zombies. I mean, the zombies obviously in TV and film right now are really big, but they don't have like a big literature history or a folk history. People aren't walking around wrapping themselves in towels and saying, I'm a zombie. People aren't dressing up in Chewbacca outfits and pretending that they're Bigfoot. I mean, so why is it that there's a culture of vampires and there's this literary history of vampires and there's this, you know, even though there was kind of, you talked about how in the 80s it kind of petered out in the film. I mean, it goes back to, I mean, Nosferatu being one of the very earliest films ever made. Obviously, all of our media and culture, it's pervasive, but not with the other, you know, monsters, if you will, the other folk monsters.
The most obvious explanation for that is that the vampire's us. You know, it looks like us. In fact, our modern concept of a vampire based mainly, I would say, on Bela Lugosi's portrayal. Even though he didn't wear fangs, you know, you see that in Sesame Street's The Count. The little traits that he has is what we probably most associate with him. The widow's peak, the bats flying around, all that. But when we go back to the earliest use of the term, I mean, the vampire entered the English language in the London Journal's March 11, 1732 issue. It was actually covering a case of an exhumation of a guy commonly referred to as Arnold Powell, and it described all the traits are there. The blood sucking, the coming back from the dead, that he must be staked, beheaded, you know, body burned. Plan B is what that reminds me of. They didn't fuck around with that. That's but what it's proved to be is a very adaptable thing, because shortly after that report was written, in the May issue of the Craftsman, 1732, the Arnold Powell case was framed in a political context where it was used as a metaphor. Once you can use something as a metaphor, it's adaptable in any way possible. And I think that's where you get the vampire community, that the door is open to allowing them to identify in that way. The other thing that has happened is that it's kind of adapted to our cultural context, in the sense that what we've seen, all these changes that we've seen coming from the 70s onward, we've humanised monsters. You know, they're not really called monsters now; they're the other. You know, and once you start humanising something like that, as Anne Rice most popularly did, then you can have a better attempt at approaching them. But they've got that little bit of something extra there, and that's the power that they have, their immortality. One of the speakers talked before about how you kind of dispense with the bad stuff. You know, that's why you can change the law as much as you want. Edward's a vegetarian vampire. You know, he doesn't feed on people, he feeds on deer, therefore that's socially acceptable. You can change it. The vampire community can get donors. You know, it's a consensual experience. It's not the same thing that it was before. That's why the vampire survives, because it is us. It adapts along with us. It's the same thing that we look at in the mirror. That's why you can get psychic vampires, because it's such an amorphous term. You know, we can use it in so many different ways. The more I try to use it strictly, the more I catch myself out, because then, hang on, what's a psychic vampire? Or if I can see Dracula in a film and he's got fangs, well, the original one didn't have fangs. There's no explanation for how they even sucked blood. All they did was they exhumed the body, the blood was dripping out of its mouth, put two and two together. It must have been feeding on. Even Barber actually points out that they didn't actually literally come out from the dead, that they came out spiritually. There's so many different variations on it that's how we can keep pace. That's why I think it's more popular, because no one's going to change into a werewolf. You know, it's not something that you can just stand here and do. But then that becomes recontextualised as well. That's the other kin community who have reframed it in their own way too. That's a whole other subject, but that's my explanation for it.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Anybody? I mean, we've asked a lot of questions today already.
I have a question for Dr. Laycock. something that you touched on that really kind of made me stop and go, whoa. At some point, if a person is feeling weak or has a migraine headache, I mean, you don't automatically go to, gee, I wonder if I drank some blood, if that would take care of that problem.
Yeah.
And there's not a doctor in this country that's going to say, have you tried drinking blood to take care of that problem? So, I mean, I wonder, you know, there's a social aspect of this whole thing that I just think that people don't really recognize. They don't pay attention to that. It's just like an accepted thing. If you could just speak to that a little bit.
But that gets back to Joseph's talk of the social construct,
right.
Because what he just said there, that's very true. There's a book by Richard Suggs called Mummies, Cannibals and Vampires, where that you would get prescribed to drinking blood. I was reading an article about it the other day, where there was a recipe for making blood jelly, and that was used as a treatment. There was the ritual before, well, a medically acceptable one of bleeding patients. Look what happened to George Washington. You know, that was an acceptable practice. The only thing that's changed is our medical knowledge. There you go. This thing, it might seem like an odd diagnosis. That's only because we're coming to it from our modern Western American or Australian or English or Canadian context or any.
Just say it's Protestant. It really is. Now I've insulted everyone. There we go. Technical Marxist.
Well, my interest in that though is why is it that they have that craving in the first place? That's where I apply a different perspective on it, because Joseph's perspective is sociological. You know, examine it as an identity group. I don't have a problem with that. What I do have a problem with is how the knowledge is propagated, because my instinct is to put the brakes on it. That's my position. It's like, hang on, before we jump ahead, what's the actual explanation for this kind of thing?
That's exactly my point too, because I'm a therapist, and then one of the first questions you ask someone is, when was the first time that you recognized this particular behavior, and what did you do for that? You know, how did you approach that?
And
so that would be the question.
Develop a pathology, don't
you?
But my belief is it's even the problem with collective terms, and this is why I debate the use of the term vampire, is because it can mean anything. You know, I don't believe the vampire community is one thing. I believe it's just a loose collective name for a whole team of people. In fact, according to Mertikas, who heads the Atlanta Vampire Association Alliance, pardon me, I'm a member of the vampire community. Why? Because I'm an enthusiast. He counts an enthusiast lifestyle as real vampires. Everyone in this room is a member of the vampire community without even realising. Why? Because it depends on the personal context of how you use the term. That's the thing you always need to seek out whenever someone talks about it. What do you mean by vampire? And that, whatever that answer is going to be, reflects their personal view on it. That's what you got a gun for. You know, I have my take. All the panellists here have their own. Look into that, and you'll find some very interesting answers.